Okay, we're live. Welcome to Dive into Worldbuilding. Today we're talking about translators. And you know what? As we were talking about it, we realized that there were lots and lots of extra issues that came along with translators. So in particular, today we're going to talk about translators who appear in fiction and what they do and some of the complications of what they do and the difference between translators and interpreters. But we're not going to talk about we're still having a little bit of an echo somewhere, but anyway, I'm not going to worry about it because it's quiet. And we're not going to talk about fiction and translation at this point. Because I think if I talk about fiction and translation, I think I will want to have some experts on the panel, and I should go and find those deliberately.
Yes.
But okay, so translators. People don't always make a distinction between translators and interpreters. But there is a big difference when you talk about them technically. Interpreters are people who translate for people who are speaking while they are speaking. Translators tend to translate texts more often, but you know, people talk casually about translators being people who are interpreters as well. So I guess we'd consider interpreters to be just sort of a slightly more specific term that's used in more limited circumstances.
Yeah, we talk about simultaneous translation, which completely muddles the issue.
Yeah.
And universal translators.
Yeah. So, okay. So, yay. You brought up the elephant in the room. Well done. That's Kat's like ultimate talent.
Should I put it on my CV?
That's right. I always
elephant wrangler.
In the room.
Yeah.
So like the babel fish that you stick in your ear should have been an interpreter.
Yeah. Well,
I'm going to turn off my video for just a second. I'll be right back.
Universal Translators started. I mean, the way I think about Universal Translators is they're mostly a gimmick that allows people to tell a story that would otherwise be sort of impossible because nobody would be able to talk to each other. And I think, in fact, that Douglas Adams, when he was writing about the Babelfish, was kind of acknowledging that, right? The Babelfish is really deliberately a gimmick. Hey, look, it's the silly thing I've done, and suddenly everybody can talk to each other. Well,
of course, he didn't invent that. There was like the Star Trek Universal thing, so.
No, I'm not saying he invented it. I'm saying that he specifically is making fun of it. And pointing out the fact that it's so gimmicky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of like, I'm going to do this random thing that's going to just make it so everybody speaks the same language, right?
So.
Yeah.
The thing about the Universal Translator as it's used is, yes, it's it's so that you don't have to actually deal with the issues of real. Sorry about the shaking. That you don't have to deal with the issues of actual translation problems and actual interpretation problems, because you just say, well, I have all these aliens and they're really aliens. No, really, they are aliens, but we can all talk to each other. Shh.
Yep.
Because most people don't want to write the how on earth did you actually communicate with each other
issue,
unless you're Suzette Hayden Elgin.
You don't see all that many code cracking scenarios. I guess that's what I'm going to call it. Code cracking scenarios being the kinds of scenarios where people are actually nitty-gritty on screen figuring out how to assign meanings to sounds, right?
Little Fuzzy.
Well, that one movie.
Yeah, Little Fuzzy
Arrival.
is definitely one. I'm just saying there aren't a ton of them.
Yeah. No, there aren't.
And because you know what? It's not that people don't do it. It's more like it requires a very specific sort of attention. I mean, in Little Fuzzy, whether they communicate or not and how they communicate is like the big question.
It's the whole story.
What's his name? Atevi. Foreigner series. Why am I not remembering who wrote those?
Jerry?
I think so. So, so there's an entire race, or there's an entire series around the issue of the protagonist is the interpreter.
Uh-huh.
And the ways in which culture has to be navigated, and it's very much front and center. Let me pull up. Yes, of course it's C.J. Cherryh's Foreigner series, and this is the reason I love that series, is because it actually makes very real the challenges around navigating between languages.
Yeah. I always appreciate it when people do that. In fact, one of the things that I've done when I've been writing stories about aliens and translation and interpretation is that I typically don't make code cracking the point of the story. What I like to do is I like to say, okay, here are some folks, and we think we've got it all figured out. We've cracked the code. We've got this down, but we're still having some major problem. And usually it has something to do with misunderstanding metaphors as literal or the literal as metaphor. That's a thing that often happens. The other thing is, cultural stuff is very, very important and complex, and we tend to act as though once we all speak the same language, it's going to sort of be a magical equalizer, when in fact it's not. So that's one of the reasons why I write the alien stories the way I do. So yeah. Translation is not a magical equalizer.
Yeah.
You know what? Are any of you familiar? Like, are any of you connected to Jim Morrow on Facebook?
I'm not sure I am. I know that you've introduced us before, Reggie.
Today he shared a short story that he had written that was published like a few years ago, and it was I don't think it would qualify as a first contact story, but in terms of translation issues, it posits like a benevolent alien force showing up during a slave auction, and the alien race interprets the activity as educational opportunities that are being denied the oppressors in that scenario. And it's kind of it's an interesting, like, tongue-in-cheek, like, way of tackling, like, he presented it today on Facebook as like a sort of a what is the word he used? Riposte about the affirmative action stuff going on with the Trump administration. I'm not explaining this very well right now, but I was just thinking about how with translation, like with language as with visible cues and like observing action, like we can always misinterpret things, and how that's a problem.
Yeah, well, I mean, misinterpretation is a huge problem, right?
Yeah, right.
I'm always going to put this point in as many times as I can get away with it, because it has to be said over and over until people actually get the clue, which is Star Trek used to do this thing where, you'd have this group of aliens and there would be all this, a big fuss made over how if you said the wrong thing, they would get really, really upset with you, and that would be a really huge problem. But it always seemed very sort of flippant when it was brought up, like, oh, these silly people, they think things are so important, and you know what I mean? Like, oh, we have to make sure we're on our best behavior. I don't know. I always get that sort of nudge, nudge, wink, wink. But when you're dealing with translation and interpretation, and you're dealing with other cultures, this stuff is not minor.
No.
Yep. The other problem with the way they do that is that they behave as though nothing, they don't have the same needs, as though there is nothing, no misstep that the other side could make that would
Right.
offend them
It's
irrevocably.
It's very human, Earth-centric, and by extension, I think you're kind of colonialist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, but to clarify the story, the story I was just talking about, it kind of turns all that on its head. Where like, okay, so the alien, advanced benevolent race gets it all wrong, but then the humans kind of rise up and take over and do the right thing, like, you know. So, but it's just that their misinterpretation and arrival created an opportunity for the oppressed to kind of rise up and take charge in the story. But I just thought, like, the role, if you had seen it, that role of misinterpretation might be something worthy of discussion by you guys who have been thinking about this.
There was did you guys see Arrival?
Yeah.
No.
Don't think so.
I missed so much.
So
it's really good. Well, I saw it on video. I didn't see it in the theaters.
I liked it. I felt annoyed by some things. You know, I guess you get deep enough in, you have lots and lots of opinions on stuff. But the two things that I really felt, well, one thing was that I felt like I was being manipulated by the structure of the film. It was sort of trapping you in a misconception, so that it could then later laugh at you about your misconception. But anyway, that's beside the point. That's not what I'm actually talking about. But you notice that when you get to the point where they're actually figuring out how to crack the code, they conveniently just sort of skip over like months of work that would be required to try to figure out.
Well, this is a film that we're talking about, right?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of do have
to. It's like you have to montage.
But you also might notice, but you also might notice that they don't really go into, they don't show you any single point where somebody is logically discovering what something must mean.
They don't do the montage. They don't show you what's part of it.
They basically show how they basically have this cool, sophisticated mapping system, right? Which I thought was really cool and sophisticated, but would take months to design, right? But they didn't actually show you at any point how they found their way into that mapping system either. And it was fine, that's fine. That's me being like, oh, come on, I want to see how you really figured it out, right?
Show me
I've been wondering why I'm getting ignored, and I realized I've muted myself. Hi.
Oh dear!
Oh my gosh!
No, it's fine. So,
Story went into that.
I've been hearing people telling me that I really need to see this, and it's interesting hearing that. I'm also fascinated because I've been hearing people. I think the open source project is called Festival. I could be wrong. But there is an open source machine translation project happening that's been happening for the last 12 years. And they're taking lexicons from very disparate languages and creating rough machine translations and refining the algorithms all the time. So I don't know.
You said it was called Festival?
I think so.
Okay.
I need to double check it. I have a friend who does a lot of work on it. He's been going between Irish and Polish, I think.
Wow.
But people have been using like Estonian and things like that as well. So, because usually these things start with English to Spanish, and then they add languages slowly, and then it does languages with different syntaxes really badly. And, we've been watching the progress of Google's Translator and other translation services. And for a while, I was actually doing secondary translation editing for an editor who was working from Japanese into English, but then I would fix her English based on what I knew of the Japanese, because I didn't want to do the primary translation. I was only doing secondary translation.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, that is a good 10 years ago, and now things are getting better, although I've seen the automatic translations, and they're better in some languages than in others. But, so how far in the future is Arrival set?
It's
actually
Is it
not.
now?
it's not.
Yeah.
It's like now, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, the thing I liked about Hoshi Sato in Enterprise, which is otherwise a series that I was not hugely fond of, is that they actually had an interpreter, a linguist on board who was made to do linguistic work.
Mm-hmm.
Because yes, you're right. The mapping thing is hand waved as well, even when they're saying, "But look, we're doing a language thing." But now I want to do a Cat finally saw Arrival and has opinions thing somewhere at some point, because I'm clearly remiss in not seeing it.
Well,
Yeah.
if you weren't gonna bring up Hoshi, I was going to, because she was a cool character, and she really was like the only time where I loved Enterprise. Okay, that's like my favorite Trek
Okay.
series.
Oh no, I'm DS9, but anyway.
I know. I am one of the outliers who was like Enterprise, and that's like, you know, nobody loves Enterprise. But it was like they had a semi-functional Universal Translator, but they needed
Right.
a human linguist to fill in the gaps when they hit walls and when the computer just failed.
Right.
So like, you know, you had like up in like, you know, Enterprise Next Generation, you know, you had like 50, 60, 70 years, 100 years of work on that thing. So that thing was like, oh, amazeballs, right? But this was like back in the early days.
Yeah,
So,
and that
like,
is
you
very
sort of
clever.
have a progression of it, but I don't think they touched on it much. It was pretty hand wavy in the 60s one, I think, because nobody really wanted to do so I don't know.
Well, I mean, genre has two conventions, right? Three conventions. One of which is either you go all Tolkien and you conlang like mad,
God, yeah.
or you just say, no, Universal Translator, forget it.
Yeah.
Or, you know, or you write a fiction that's based on, oh, look, we're going to look at languages, like Suzette Hayden Eldon, which, you know, is only about the language. So,
Well, I mean, I think honestly, that's in some ways what we do with almost anything, right? Like, I mean, faster than light travel. We either have it or we don't have it, or the whole point of the story is how it works, right? I think honestly that has to do more with story focus.
I think you're right.
You know, I mean, and it's not a problem.
Break this.
It's not a problem, but I think it's one of the sort of narrative constraints. I mean,
right.
If depending on how far you want to go, it's very easy for a process like translation or engineering to sort of monopolize your entire narrative. Right. Which is why I don't ever talk about faster than light travel in my stories. I'm always like, we're here, let's do the thing.
I confess that I have completely done the aliens gave it to us and we just use it approach.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Which is cheating, but
I don't think that's cheating though, because I think what that does is open up an opportunity to create complications later or in a sequel.
Yeah,
the aliens gave it to us and we just use it without question, kind of.
Oh, sure. I mean, yeah, you can definitely create complications based on that, because why would they just give it to you again? I mean,
and what happens when it breaks?
Yeah, Embassy Town is another. Jeez.
I haven't
the funny thing is, you know what? Embassy Town is another one of those books where, like Arrival, what for the movies was like, it was like my homework. Like, you have to read this, Juliet. You have to read this. I'm like, okay, I'll read it. Right. It was a very interesting language concept.
Embassy Town. I have not read this.
Yeah. Okay. So it's basically involves these aliens that have, yeah, it was two mouths, right? And
It was two mouths or two heads. I have the book. I haven't read it yet. It's one of those I'm saving.
They speak in two tones at once, and so they have to actually be translated by pairs of people. But the pairs of people also have to be kind of psychically aligned in this particular way. It's a very interesting language concept. And the problem of the translators, and I think actually this is a good way for us to sort of segue into the problem that is involved in having human translators, right? In Embassy Town, you had to have these translators. You had to have these translators, but they couldn't just be talking at the same time. They had to like mean the same thing in a particular way. Now I'm hearing weird sound.
All right, let's see.
A little static.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
Oh, poor Reggie.
Oh.
I'm sorry, Reggie. Anyway, so I thought that was an interesting language concept. A very, very interesting one. And people ended up being bred as translators.
Wow, I'm reading the Wikipedia synopsis. That's fascinating. Yes.
It's fascinating. Yeah, really cool language concept. And in fact, one of the things that people really, really like to play with when they're dealing with alien languages is the SapirWhorf hypothesis. So I'm going to just wave my hands at it right now. Which is the SapirWhorf hypothesis was the one that said basically that your language and your language is an influence on your cognition and vice versa. There were two versions of the hypothesis. One was the strong version, which is basically doesn't make any sense at all, which is to say that you can't think of anything that you can't say, which is clearly not how things work. But the weak hypothesis says that your language deeply influences your cognition and how you think about things, which is actually, that is a thing. And people are studying it now. Continuing to there was a period when everybody was like, oh yeah, the SapirWhorf hypothesis has been debunked, and then and you know what?
Who said that? Who actually said that?
Can you put that in the
Because
chat?
any bilingual who speaks
Can't spell that.
sufficiently diverse languages will jump up and down and say that's not true.
Right.
So
Well,
who is
okay,
saying
so
it's
I'm going to
debunked?
say something though. I think this is important to remark. I think this is important to remark. A lot the concept of Universal Translator, I think, grew out of the concept of Chomsky and universal grammar.
Yes.
And the idea that, well, we all have these basic building blocks in our heads because they're somehow platonically ideal, and so we all have them in common. And it kind of extends that to, you know, the entirety of the universe, where, oh, all of a sudden everybody's going to have these same basic language building blocks in their head. No. Right?
Chomsky doesn't work.
Yeah, no. I really am not a proponent of Chomsky and universal grammar, but it was a very popular concept.
Chomsky and universal grammar is really useful if you are a computational linguist trying to work on mechanical translation schema.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I'm saying, is it really underlies the idea of a mechanical universal translator.
what was that other one you were talking about? That language is an influence on cognition and language affects
That's called the
cognition?
SapirWhorf Hypothesis. I will write it down.
Okay, yeah, because there's damn spelling.
It's hard to spell because it's two different people's last names.
That's two different, yeah, researchers.
And also, if you are a genre geek, it's always a moment of panic of, wait, is it an H or not?
Yeah, right, because they're like,
Worf.
all I'm thinking is Worf from Star Trek, though, thank you, because now my brain is all on Star Trek.
No, I mean, as somebody who does speak multiple languages and grew up with two very different languages, it's absolutely true. There are things that are really, really difficult to say. There are obligatory parts of speech that come from other languages where, you know, I often tell the story about my mother remarking to me that she thought it was interesting that all of my friends were younger siblings, and why did I not have any firstborn friends? And I looked at her and I said, what are you talking about? And I realized that because English doesn't gloss for birth order when discussing siblings, I was defaulting to using older brother and older sister as a neutral word.
Oh, yeah.
And using younger brother and younger sister as a marked word. And so I was never saying younger brother or sister unless I knew for certain. And so I would say so-and-so's older brother. And it was one of those things where, because when I was talking to my peers, I was speaking in English, I wasn't having the semantic space for, I need to make sure I know which word to properly use.
Yeah.
I was just glossing in a word that worked well enough. And then I tell the story to my mother, and I wouldn't have the vital piece of data to make it actually accurate.
Yeah.
So.
And you know what? They say that if you speak a language that has grammatical gender, that you actually have an opinion of what your own gender is earlier than if you don't have that in your language.
Interesting.
Or you're able to speak about it, at least.
That's interesting, and I want to see how that study plays out, because...
Yeah, there are a lot of complications possible there.
There are lots of possible complications.
Grammatical gender
Grammatical gender means that, like, nouns can be male or female.
Yeah.
Like tables and chairs as opposed to just be, okay.
I have seen the studies that talk about the fact that gendering nouns leads to people associating gendered concepts with those nouns, so that depending upon whether bridge is male or female in your language, you might think of them as more connective and ethereal versus solid and stable, and that it changes the framing. And now I'm wondering what happens if you learn two languages with opposing genders for a noun simultaneously, as opposed to having an ordering so that there would be a default in your head.
But you know what? I think that would depend on what your language of origin was, because I think for like an American learning something like that, it would just be like, you would have to just consciously try to remember which one, but it might not form so much of an opinion. But if you were coming from one language and going to another. I'm
theorizing about a child who would be raised bilingually by parents teaching the child gendered languages of opposing genders for certain words. Because it does happen. You could have a parent who speaks one gendered language and a parent who speaks a different gendered language, and children do grow up bilingual.
Children also grow up without learning English at all. You know, there are just billions of people who never learn English. And I think that throwing English into the mix and making it 3 languages would change the situation completely, because you'd have something else to compare it to.
Okay, now I had sort of I wanted to back up a little bit, because you're talking about machine languages, and it got me thinking, like, if machine life were encountered, would they be easier to talk to than organic life?
Sorry, you're positing an organism that is created without
chemical, like the
organic beings?
robot. How
Well,
like AI, like a whole society that was nothing but AIs. That shows up in sci-fi a lot. But
actually, you could also posit that if you natural languages are naturally very, very complex, right? And conlangs tend to be less complex until they actually break out of their molds and start being used as actual languages, and start undergoing processes of language change and stuff like that, which doesn't happen with computer languages, or at least not with computer languages that haven't been generated by an AI.
Let's go back a step here. When we say AIs, are we positing AIs that were created by protoplasmic beings, let's say? Or I mean, I think you need to go back to what's the starting point, because
so their programming language would be related to whatever created them, even if whatever created them was completely gone, like for millions of years or something.
Well, but forget about that for a second. I mean, like, their creators don't have to be gone.
Yeah.
Right?
We had just in the news last week an issue of somebody's chatbots had created a shorthand amongst themselves for communicating things.
Yes.
Yeah.
They shut it down. It was Facebook. They shut it down because they couldn't. It came about spontaneously, I think, and they couldn't control how the algorithms work. But they did study it very slightly, and I think it's nonsensical when you read it. But they showed the the excerpt. Did you see that, Kat?
I didn't have time to read the whole story. I've got it bookmarked.
But it's like it does things like repeats pronouns like 3 times, and that within that bot language signifies different meaning, but to us it looks like nonsense, and that was one of the reasons they made the decision, I think, to shut it down. I think, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, we're gonna have robot overlords soon, aren't we?
I don't think so, but
no.
Facebook decides what you see, how close it's at to a robot overlord.
All I can hope is that they're better than what we have now, which is a low bar.
So let's get back to this question about AI, though. I think AI language is going to be based on the language of whoever makes the AI.
Right.
So part of the problem with this whole thing when we talk about alien language is that we have no guarantees that alien language is going to look anything like our languages at all. Right. I don't tend to worry about that when I'm writing fiction, because it's like, why bother? The stories that we tell are for humans; they're not for aliens. So, so I'm just going to be like, yeah, well, exactly, Reggie. So my character Ruli is very dog-like, and he has a lot of olfactory stuff that he does, and I altered English grammar so that I could write his point of view. Because the more alien language you use in a story, the less accessible it is to actual humans. So,
I mean, you can write your entire story in Tengwar, but you kind of reduced your.
It's going to reduce your audience
by a lot. In the original Klingon.
Yeah, right? Oh, yeah.
God. Okay, so you know what? I'm going to...
Conlangs is an entirely different episode.
I'm going to try to bring us back here to the question of translators, because when you are not using a mechanical translator...
Right.
And you are using a human translator or an alien translator, you are still stuck with a big problem, and that is that the translator has a body that is potentially in danger. Right? And they can come under influence or be threatened, right?
Tired,
You
distracted.
end up turning the fallibility and peril of the translator become a major
Right.
component of your story, because reliability and ease become affected by things that are happening to your translator.
And if you are, and for example, if you think about the people who ended up translating for the conquistadors in South America,
Right.
that is a pretty sticky position to be in, right?
Yes.
And you end up with a figure like La Malinche, who was a translator between Cortez and the Aztecs. And she was, quote unquote, married to Cortez. There's got to be more to that, right?
Oh, yeah. No.
I mean, so you're in a position, I mean, you can be in a very untenable position as a translator, particularly when you're dealing with power plays by invaders, that kind of thing.
Does anybody else speaking today have any experience doing interpretation or translation?
Not a lot.
Okay.
A little bit.
So, I found it interesting when I was studying to be an ASL interpreter, which I did not complete, because one of the things I was, people who know me will sort of chuckle and go, well, of course. It became very obvious that I don't have the requisite temperament to be a good interpreter. Because a good interpreter, by ethical code, at least for interpretation for the deaf, is a human machine and is transparent and is solely there to provide a conduit for the deaf person to express to the hearing person, and to be the conduit for the hearing person to have their words, their vocalizations turned into gesture. And as an ethical interpreter, you are not supposed to interject any of your own thoughts at all. I found this incredibly difficult.
Well, I don't
can't
think it's
sit
actually
through a panel
possible
without making face. So,
I mean, I think that to think that that is actually possible is maybe it's close to possible.
It's not about whether or not the interpreter has any thoughts. It's about whether the interpreter is allowed to express them, or whether it's considered, whether the ethical constraint on the interpreter is to say, hey, I know more about this situation than either of you, I'm going to say something, or whether the constraint on the interpreter is, I am solely here to be bridging the two languages and my own sensibility doesn't matter.
Right.
It is an ethical conundrum, and it's an artificially imposed one, because it's, if you're in an intermediate position between friends, for instance, you are expected to stick your nose into that. It's a difference between doing it casually and doing it as a profession or as a discipline or a trade. There's also the issue of child translators, which is a common thing in immigrant communities.
Yeah.
Where children are brought in to be interpreters for their parents.
Yep.
And translators for their parents. And so there's an entire list of stories that you'll see from children of immigrant writers who talk about, having to bring in the note from the teacher that says something terrible, and the child blithely saying, oh, it just says that I'm going to be recognized for being an awesome student, so could you sign the recognition form, please?
Yeah.
And actually, your kid was ditching school and whatever. And also the ways in which those children are what is now called parentified, and their emotional and relationship structure with their parents becomes weird because of this. Also, deaf children end up doing this for their or sorry, hearing children end up doing this for their deaf parents and all of this, but it's another form of how does the role affect somebody, which is one of those interesting things that Suzette Hayden Alden was writing about when she was creating her linguists, where the babies were purpose-built.
It's also an issue in Sheila Finch's xenolinguist stories.
Right.
And the whole idea of a conduit is, you know, they spend a lot of time going, I am a conduit. But you know what? People aren't conduits, right? And language is not a conduit either. So it tends to make things complicated.
It goes back to that service animals and servants and other forms of work discussions that we've had in other weeks, where, you know, how much can you ask a person to effectively dehumanize themselves in service of a task you need to get accomplished?
You know, there was, again, it was another China Miéville in his book The Scar, and it's a very brief scene, but the main character is a translator, and she signs on to this ship to go do this business meeting thing as a way to get out of New Crobazon. And she goes into a translation trance. And I forgot how it was accomplished. It was like semi-magical. You know, because there's magic and science and technology all in this world. So I mean that I thought that was like a really interesting idea. So it's like she didn't really know what she was saying. She was just saying it.
Well, you know, okay. I have thoughts. One of the things that I think that we've missed here just a little bit, and I'm not, so there is a level on which you want to say, I got to step out of this as much as possible, et cetera, et cetera. There's also a level on which you're kind of stuck because your choice of word is going to reflect your own judgment on what you're hearing on a level that you can't necessarily control.
Let's talk about that, because for instance, Suzette created Laodan specifically so that in theory you wouldn't be able to do that if you were translating from Laodan to English, because the chain of credibility was such a intrinsic feature of the grammar as the language was envisioned. If the speaker says, this is absolutely true, I witnessed this, and the interpreter knows they are lying because they have independent reason to know that they didn't say it. Now we do have a dilemma where the interpreter can actually say what was said in that language, or the interpreter can correct the data, but then they are interjecting their own selves. And that is a choice that's being made at that moment. It's not, you know, the choice between whether to use pernicious or pervasive or universal. These are all, you know, these are all things that you do, but really you also know when you're translating from one language to another what is really meant.
Yeah, and you know what? Actually, here's a really great place where you can see some of this going on, some of the complications involved. And that is, I believe it was The Daily Show did a segment on translating Trump.
Oh,
did you see that?
There've been a couple different things.
Yeah, it's on YouTube.
Yeah.
They tried this with some high-level Japanese interpreters who'd done political translations, and the conniption fits they were having.
Yeah, they did that on Samantha Bee as well, where she was like trying to get them to.
Oh, that's Samantha Bee. Yes. That was where I saw
as dumb and angry as Trump is.
Yeah.
She's like, no, you're not doing it right. It sounds too sensible.
Yeah, no, I think
well, I mean,
well, the Daily Show did it too.
Okay.
There's been a lot.
I think a lot of people have been doing it because they're aware of this. It's an ethical dilemma for the translator, because do you actually... So I'm going to just use Japanese and English because they're the easiest things for me to access, and they're the most obviously disparate of the languages I can easily talk about.
Yeah.
Normally, insults in Japanese are formed by using words of wildly varying politeness levels from what's appropriate. So you can start a fight by being excessively polite or by being excessively casual. And the truth is that he's beyond excessively casual.
Yeah.
He's actually rude in English. But if you accurately translate Trump's words into Japanese, then you've got this issue of potentially causing an international incident because he's vomited words into somebody's lap.
Yeah.
To evoke somebody else's diplomatic faux pas. You know, it's that thing of what do you call it when he kisses somebody who got a medal afterward? Do you actually accurately describe it as a sexual assault?
Yeah.
These are choices being made by the interpreter at the time, and also by their peril and their internalized ethics and their sense of responsibility and their sense of, well, I'm just going to let you understand what was being said by the body language and the way that the words were emitting from the mouth, even if I put on this bland mechanical translation. Why, greetings, Ambassador, how are you doing today? When really something much different was said.
Yeah.
And we have these stories from the Cold War about Russian interpreters saying things that were not accurate in order to try to save their clients on one side or the other.
Yeah.
Accuracy and truth are not necessarily the same thing.
And in fact, sorry, I'm writing notes. Politeness and honesty are often at odds.
I'm thinking about entire volumes of Pratchett now. Also, you know, lots of classic SF talks about the difference in politeness levels between cultures, and that there's a certain discomfort in the interstice. And so, Julia, you've talked about not doing the alien language in the moment of hacking the language, but I feel like this is one of the things that's really missing in a lot of first contact stories.
Which is?
There's such an assumption that we have enough framework in common to gesturally or somehow or other communicate and reach the same conclusions. And, you know?
Yep.
We assume that people will have the same body structure as us that are aliens.
Yep.
I mean, really, does a starfish see the world the same way that a bipedal terrestrial organism does?
I think, you know what? Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And my personal view on actual alien languages, should it be encountered, is maybe we've already encountered it and we just can't even grasp that it's language, right?
We don't know what dolphins are saying.
We don't know what dolphins are saying. We don't know what elephants are saying, right?
I think they've managed to get a little bit from dolphin. Only because dolphins can and do understand English. But it's still not.
Yeah.
I mean, but they've also, like, dolphins have been studied for years, and we've still got basically like almost nothing. There are some, I think, bird vocabularies have been cracked, but
I think one of the things that often gets forgotten is how many different underlying fundamental assumptions we have that are similar to those of people with other spoken human languages. Like, for example, that we are air breathers, right?
Names.
names, that people can be, you know, that objects exist.
Individual identity, corporality.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, the fact, if you don't agree with an alien about whether objects exist, we're going to have a hard time. Right?
Yeah.
You know, so Reggie's damn air breathers. Right. But my point being that the possibilities for what language would look like in a case where the environment was very different. I mean, language is contextual. And I harp on this a lot, so I won't go on and on about it because we're at the end of the hour. But language is contextual.
Yes.
And if you do not share any context with somebody, it makes it very, very difficult to try to get things across. And in fact, I did appreciate it in Arrival when the linguist was saying, I can't figure this out without context, right? I have to go talk to them because if we're not in the shared space, then we're not going to find our way across, right? So, yeah.
It's hard
Anyway.
enough communicating when you have ostensibly the same language, but no shared context.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is the work I'm doing a lot. This is why I'm writing that dictionary of social justice, is that things are being said that because the context varies so wildly for us, depending upon class and race and other factors, that we say the same things, and what's being said is interpreted so very differently.
Yeah.
So I haven't yet seen somebody do something that's not jokey about aliens who learned one kind of language from humans and then tried to apply it to everybody else. Most of those are really played for laughs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm kind of going,
So I'm going to make one last point, which is to go back to the conduit metaphor of language, which I referred to earlier. And it is actually one of the most hampering metaphors that we possess about the nature of language. Okay. So the conduit metaphor of language basically says that I have a meaning that I mean in my head, and I'm going to put it into a language form. And that language form is going to act like a conduit, like a little tube, and it is going to take the meaning from my head through my mouth into your ear, and it's going to land in your head. That is not how language works. Okay? Meanings are built up from the context in which you've heard the word before. And so whenever you utter it, it is activating all the contexts in which you've heard it. But when somebody hears it, it's actually activating all the contexts in which they have heard it. It has nothing to do with the context that you used to base your choice of that word. So, the effect that it's going to have in another person's head is going to depend entirely on whether they've heard the word before and where and how and in what context.
and from whom?
And from whom? Well, so context includes the speaker, right?
Yeah.
Inextricably includes
Speaker,
the speaker,
situation, yeah.
the time of day, you know, like it includes basically the whole scene in which you encountered it. And whether that scene was emotionally charged, all kinds of things. So, so translation is very fraught, and there's a lot more to talk about, but we don't have time. So we'll come back to it another time. In the meantime, I am going to say that we're done for today. And I'm going to look for a second and see if I have. I'm going to look and see what I have in my notes for topics for next week. Don't let me down, Google Chrome.
I remember some of them because we had like alcohol from Morgan. I wanted to do educational systems. We never did get to libraries. And then there were a couple last week we brought up that I can't remember.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think maybe educational systems might be a good one to do.
Okay. I was about to suggest children in play.
Children in play. I'm going to write that down. It helps me if I write it on my notes, and then, and then I can look back at my notes and go, oh, yeah. Okay.
Although the other one I want to propose, because I'm in the middle of the summer here, is temperature control systems.
Temperature control. Oh, it sounds very interesting. Oh my goodness. Okay, so now I have like all the ideas. Okay, so
only because I treat this as the regular panel of all the things of ever that
it is the all ever panel.
Well, to piggyback on that suggestion, warning systems, and it popped I just got an extreme weather warning on my phone, which was crazy. But different levels of culture, language, technology, it's a big intersection.
Have we talked about communication systems?
Have we?
How about we do that? How about we do communication systems and warning systems, kind of on the same little vibe?
That makes sense.
Does that sound fair? Yeah. Okay, that sounds good. Okay, I will be in touch. I'm going to stop the broadcast for now, but so let's assume that, barring messages saying otherwise from me, we'll meet next Wednesday at 10 and talk about communication systems in the morning.
Sounds awesome. Thanks.
All right, love you guys. Here to stop the broadcast.